Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. We're starting a deep dive today into a set of ideas that are, well, somehow both incredibly bleak but also strangely energizing. We're looking at Mark Fisher's final lectures, which were compiled into the book Postcapitalist Desire. And this isn't just theory, it's really a toolkit for seeing the walls of the world we're in.
It's a vital project, really. What Fisher was trying to do was answer this massive systemic question that just hangs over everything right now.
Which is,
why does capitalist society keep reproducing itself? I mean, we all feel it, right? The dissatisfaction is everywhere. People are miserable at work. Politics feels completely stagnant, broken even.
Yeah, totally broken.
And yet, despite all that frustration, despite the, the urgent need for something new, the status quo just persists. Why is it so hard to move on?
That persistence is the real puzzle. Because we're living in this era of, well, technological abundance. We have automation that could drastically cut down how much we all have to work.
We have information, goods, digital things, knowledge that you can copy 1,000,000 times for basically zero cost.
Exactly. So logically, we have the foundation, the material basis, to build something different, something with more leisure, more fulfillment. But instead, we get this feeling he called frenzied stasis.
Frenzied stasis. That just nails the modern condition, doesn't it?
It really does.
We're all running faster than ever, checking emails constantly, managing a digital self, dealing with this endless churn of news and social media.
And
yet politically, culturally, we're just stuck. We're in repeat mode. No genuinely new futures seem, even imaginable. It really feels like a systems failure, a structural lock-in, not just a bunch of people failing to have good ideas.
And that is such a crucial frame for this entire deep dive. We have to be clear. We're focusing on the structural patterns, the machineries, as he put it.
The cultural institutions, the attention economies.
The rules that govern how we work, how we socialize, the things that actively create this condition. We are not here to, pass moral judgment on you for having an iPhone.
No.
The problem is structural. So the solution has to be structural.
Exactly. Fisher knew that to get past what he called capitalist realism, that pervasive feeling that there's just no alternative, we have to find the mechanism. We have to see how capitalism captures all that transformative energy and just redirects it back into maintaining itself.
Okay, so let's unpack this and let's ground ourselves in the source material first. For anyone who isn't familiar, Mark Fisher was this hugely influential cultural theorist and educator, and he's probably most famous for coining and really defining that term, capitalist realism.
Right. And what he meant by that was this pervasive atmosphere where, it doesn't matter if you're a left-wing politician or a right-wing economist. The basic assumptions about markets, about privatization, about how things should be managed, they all stay the same.
His earlier work, though, could be quite sharp, quite negative in its critique. He really didn't pull any punches. I mean, he once called the 60s counterculture hedonic infantilism.
Yeah, suggesting it was all about self-expression without any real political, rigor behind it. But by the time we get to Postcapitalist Desire, he was making a very deliberate shift. He was trying to move beyond just being negative.
And that's where his final unfinished project comes in. He was starting to build this idea he called acid communism,
which was this incredibly constructive attempt to reclaim the emancipatory potential of the past, that fusion of psychedelic liberation, collective living, and radical politics.
So Postcapitalist Desire is basically the toolkit for that project.
That's it. It's compiled from his postgraduate lectures at Goldsmiths in 2016 and 2017. He was basically running a workshop for his students, handing them the analytical weapons,
The theoretical framework.
The framework they would need to build a new left, a left that wasn't just stuck moralizing at itself or lost in nostalgia.
And the context for those lectures is so important. This is post-2008 crash, right in the middle of austerity, rising populism, huge technological shifts.
The economic system had just spectacularly failed, and yet its ideology was still completely ironclad.
Okay, so let's state the central thesis that's going to anchor our whole deep dive here, just in plain language.
Okay.
Capitalism persists, not just because of economic force or political power, but because it structurally shapes and captures desire itself.
Right. It absorbs our revolutionary energy, it neutralizes opposition, and this is the most dangerous part. It makes any post-capitalist alternative feel not just difficult, but completely unrealistic, emotionally impossible even.
So the system isn't just managing the economy.
No, it's managing what we want, what we find fun, what we think of as liberation.
Which means the whole fight is being waged on a psychological and a cultural level. If capitalism has captured all the things that make life feel exciting and vital, change, freedom, self-expression,
Then just arguing with logic or morality isn't going to be enough.
it's not enough.
Fisher's point was that you need a counter-libido, a positive, collective, and alternative form of desire. It's not enough to just say no to capitalism. He called that an anti-libidinal dampening.
You need a better yes.
You need a better yes. A vision of collective joy and liberation that is just fundamentally more attractive than the little fragmented pleasures you get from buying things.
This is where it gets so interesting. If we're looking for the systems that capture desire, we have to start where desire is literally manufactured.
Advertising.
Advertising. And Fisher used it not just as a cultural symptom, but as a kind of a negative masterclass in how this capture works, a precise structural mechanism.
We can start with the classic example, the one everyone knows.
Yep.
The Apple 1984 Super Bowl commercial,
Well-
directed by Ridley Scott. It's a perfect case study.
Right.
If we break it down using Fisher's framework, system design, incentive structure, and outcome, you can see this whole psychological operation play out in just 60 seconds.
The visuals are so stark. You have these endless lines of gray, sort of genderless drones marching into this giant authoritarian hall.
Big Brother is on the screen lecturing them. It's an undeniable nod to, the dreariness of Soviet-style control.
And then this woman, in bright colors, runs in, chased by riot police, and she hurls a sledgehammer right into the screen, shattering that face of control.
The system design there is what Freud called dream work. It's condensation, it's conflation. It deliberately takes the old enemy, the Soviet Union, the Cold War monolith, all that gray bureaucracy, and equates it with the corporate monoliths of the time.
IBM.
IBM is the clear target. And in doing that, it performs this brilliant ideological sleight of hand.
And the incentive structure immediately tells you, Apple is the antidote. If you buy an Apple computer, you're not one of the gray drones.
No, you're the revolutionary. You're the one with the sledgehammer. The incentive is this feeling of dynamic, individual, anti-authoritarian liberation that you purchase as a commodity.
And the outcome is the really crucial part from a systems view. Fisher said this ad was hyperstitional.
Which is a fantastic word.
What does it mean?
The hyperstition is when a fiction, once you introduce it into the world, starts to actively shape reality. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That ad didn't just sell computers, it helped create the very idea that the new corporate culture was about desire, about liberation, about being the cool upstart.
It's just devastatingly clever because it completely neutralized the political critique of corporate power.
Exactly. The old left's critique of big monolithic corporations, which was really strong in the 70s, just got absorbed by this new, flexible, networked capitalism.
The desire for freedom was captured, bottled, and sold back to us as an operating system. The system literally co-opted the idea of rebellion.
And you see this everywhere from that era. Think about the Levi's commercials.
Oh, right, with smuggling the blue jeans into the dreary black and white Soviet world.
Yeah. The system design just reinforces that narrative over and over. The communist world blocks desire. It's gray, it's stagnant.
And the outcome is that political freedom, vitality, color, all of it becomes fundamentally linked to buying Western goods. To be free is to consume. To express yourself is to buy.
Now, let's fast forward this idea to, say, the Occupy movement after 2010. Remember the critique that was always leveled at the protesters.
How can you be anti-capitalist if you're drinking Starbucks?
Or tweeting from your iPhone.
Right.
And while that's a very cynical, surface-level argument, unless you go live in a cave, you can't protest. Fisher saw the deeper, more troubling thing it revealed.
Which is?
It reveals a profound systemic truth. We might ethically or politically reject capitalism. We might want change on an intellectual level. But on the libidinal level, the level of our desires, our emotional attachments, we are already deeply invested in and often enjoying the world capitalism has built.
The system didn't just provide the goods, it captured the emotional charge, the feeling of dynamism, creativity, energy. It's associated all of that so completely with its own mechanisms that to reject capitalism feels like rejecting joy itself.
It turns the whole struggle from a simple economic argument into this core battle over imagination and emotional commitment.
And that's the real gravity of the challenge, isn't it? We're not just fighting a set of bad laws. We're fighting a system that has successfully structured what it feels like to be alive today.
Right. And if that's the case, if the system holds on even when technology offers alternatives and people are deeply unhappy, we have to look at how it enforces constraints.
Which brings us directly to this concept of surplus repression. Fisher pulled this heavily from the work of Herbert Marcuse.
Yeah, specifically his 1955 masterpiece, Eros and Civilization. And to get it, we have to start with the Freudian baseline Marcuse was working from.
Which is that civilization requires repression.
Basically, yeah. Freud's idea of the reality principle is that we have to delay pleasure and do unpleasant work to survive. But that whole model is built on one core assumption: scarcity.
If there aren't enough resources to go around, some degree of self-denial and mandatory work is just necessary for the group to survive.
Exactly. Historically, that makes perfect sense. If you spend all day having fun, the fields don't get sown, the shelters don't get built. Repression is a necessary evil to overcome hardship.
But then comes this crucial systemic shift. Marcuse saw it with industrialization, and Fisher applied it to our digital age.
The system design of technology mechanization, automation, knowledge sharing, it starts to solve the old problem of scarcity. We can now fulfill human needs with much, much less toil.
So we go from a world of natural scarcity to a world of technical abundance. Logically, the reality principle should relax. We should get mass liberation, less work, more free time.
We should. But the incentive structure of capital fights back hard. As the real possibility of liberation gets closer, the system has to intensify its constraints. It has to repress that potential for freedom, or else the whole established order of domination would just dissolve.
Marcuse put it so starkly. Civilization has to defend itself against the specter of a world which could be free.
And the outcome of that defense is surplus repression. All the social pressures, the psychological burdens, the economic hurdles that are maintained beyond what is actually necessary for survival. This surplus only exists to preserve the power structure, to preserve the work ethic, and to stop a post-capitalist world from emerging.
And the most direct, most brutal way we all experience this surplus repression today is through the artificial scarcity of time.
That's the core mechanism. Capitalism creates an artificial scarcity of time in order to hide the actual abundance of goods and potential leisure. We're kept constantly busy, overworked, anxious about deadlines.
Even when so much of that work, as Data Graeber pointed out, is basically bullshit jobs that don't produce any real social value.
And just think about the daily cost of that for you, the listener. If you're struggling with time poverty after a long workday, the commute, the double day of housework and emotional labor, you lack the fundamental thing you need for political action.
Time and energy.
Time and energy. If you're too exhausted to read a book, go to a meeting, or even just have a real sustained conversation with your neighbors, then the magical golden machine, our collective ability to organize, it might as well not exist.
The system makes sure we have just enough energy left to consume and to complain online, but not enough to organize and imagine. And what makes it so tricky is that today, this subjection often feels like a voluntary compulsion.
That's the insidious genius of it. No one is physically forcing you to check your work email at 11 p.m.
No factory manager is standing over you.
Right. Or forcing you to constantly curate your online brand. But you do it. Our participation is freely given, but it is unfreely exploited. Capital just installs itself as a parasite on our basic human desire for connection and recognition, and it routes all of that through platforms that extract huge value from it.
You know, the old Fordist factory worker could at least go home. Physically, they were free from the boss's direct commands.
But now, with work and life all blurred together, with the constant availability you need in the gig economy, and this voluntary pressure to maintain a digital persona, there's no escape. Capitalist demands are just always running in the background.
And that constant low-level exhaustion is the mechanism of surplus repression.
Which brings us to the historical moment when this possibility of liberation was almost real, and the system had to clamp down the hardest. The counterculture of the 1960s and 70s.
Fisher was completely fascinated by the sheer ambition of that moment. He saw it as more than just music and clothes. It was a planned, social and psychic revolution of almost inconceivable magnitude.
A fusion of anti-authoritarian leftism with these radical new struggles around class, race, and gender.
And what made it so potent, so revolutionary, was the shift in demands. It went from quantitative to qualitative.
What do you mean by that?
Well, workers weren't just asking for better pay or shorter hours anymore, the old union demands. They started asking about the nature of work itself. They were demanding the abolition of work, communal living, a whole different way of being.
The anti-work ethic was central. I mean, think about the pop songs from that era that smuggled these really radical ideas into the mainstream.
Stay in bed, float upstream.
Exactly. The message was, refuse to submit to the drudgery of labor. And that was the establishment's greatest fear. They could handle some hippies in a park. What they couldn't handle was the working class becoming hippies.
The fusion of psychedelic, liberated consciousness with class consciousness.
If the people actually running the factories and offices decided their boredom wasn't worth the paycheck, the whole system could collapse overnight.
So how did the system fight back? What were the mechanisms of deflection and co-option?
Well, Fisher points to a few things. There were historical factors like the recession in the 70s, deindustrialization, unions being co-opted, but the real weapon was capital's sheer metabolic capacity.
Its ability to just eat things.
That's the system design right there. Capitalism has this incredible ability to absorb creative, self-reinventing desires. It takes that raw energy of transformation, cools it down, strips out the politics, and sells it back to you as a commodity.
This is the core of what sociologists Boltanski and Chiapello called the new spirit of capitalism. The demand for autonomy, for flexibility, for creative freedom, it didn't just disappear.
No, it was co-opted. It became the new ideology for managers.
Right. Think about the shift from the old, rigid, hierarchical corporation of the 50s to the cool, flexible, networked startup culture.
The counterculture demanded creative, meaningful work, not boring repetition. And capital said, okay, great, you can have creative, autonomous work, but you'll also have to constantly reinvent yourself, be digitally tethered 24/7, and work 80 hours a week on precarious contracts.
The form of the demand was met, but the revolutionary substance was completely neutralized. The revolutionary appeal just became another brand identity.
And the outcome of that systemic failure was twofold. First, you get capitalist realism, the inability to imagine an alternative economic system. And second, you get what the theorist Helen Hester calls domestic realism.
The inability to imagine alternatives to the traditional patriarchal family.
And this domestic realism creates these persistent psychological double binds, especially for women. The system bombards you with contradictory messages.
On one hand, be independent, love your body, be a career success.
And on the other, but also be a perfect mother, maintain an impossible beauty standard, and by the way, here's a punishing new diet.
Those double binds are so functional for the system. They keep all our psychic energy turned inward, chasing these impossible private goals.
So that energy can't be directed outward toward a collective critique of the structure itself. The psychological treadmill is a key part of maintaining control.
So to fight this, we have to move beyond those individual traps and actually see the whole system. This is where Fisher brings in Lukács' concept of reification.
Which is a German term that basically means thingification, crystallization.
So in simple terms, reification is when an ideology takes something that's actually a dynamic, open-ended process, a process of becoming, and it turns it into a fixed, solid, permanent thing.
And that's how ideology succeeds. It disappears by claiming, I'm not an ideology, I'm just nature. This is just the way things are.
Let's use a concrete example, like education. At its core, education is a dynamic human process of learning and inquiry. It's a relationship.
But under capitalist realism, education gets reified. It becomes a fixed, quantifiable product. A set of certificates, a degree you buy, a debt you take on, all to get your access to the labor market.
The moment it becomes a product, the living relationship is hidden. And the system can start treating the university like a corporation selling a service, not a space for collective thought. The process gets turned into a thing.
And the central obstacle to fighting this is that it's so hard to see the totality. Capitalism is huge and abstract. You don't experience it all at once.
Your experience is fragmented. It's your specific debt, your individual boss, the things you buy, your personal anxiety. You never meet capitalism face to face.
This fragmentation is why consciousness raising is so incredibly fragile. Consciousness, especially class consciousness, it's not automatic. It has to be actively constructed.
Through conversation, through sharing experiences, through analysis.
And that construction process is productive. It creates a new collective subject, a we, that can suddenly see how all those personal problems are actually structural issues.
And the system design works around the clock to prevent that from happening. Fisher pointed a finger at what he called the petite bourgeoisie, which dominates the academy and the culture industry.
He argued that they subtly but effectively stop the topic of class from ever really coming up in a structural way. It's treated as impolite or crude to suggest that resource distribution, not personal morality, is the real problem.
And the media reinforces this with what Fisher called the bourgeois gaze. You can see this in reality TV shows about working class life, the kind of poverty porn content.
Fisher's argument was that the very framing of those shows enforces a middle-class perspective that silently judges the participants as being morally or motivationally flawed.
The reason for their hardship is always presented as a deficit in will and effort, not a lack of resources or a systemic failure. It turns poverty back into a moral failing.
It's a devastating feedback loop. The media acts as the narrative, confirming the idea that the middle class is the default neutral position and anyone struggling must be individually to blame.
The outcome is just another affirmation of, there is no alternative.
And this fragmentation gets pushed to the absolute maximum by digital platforms. Instead of building a collective subject, we get these tiny, fragmented political identities.
And when you put those identities into the attention economy of social media, they often just turn on each other.
This is where Fisher's famous and controversial vampire castle critique comes in. He was looking at the structural dynamics that make the left eat itself.
On platforms like Twitter, the whole game can shift from challenging the system to competing over who has the most moral authority or who can claim the most disadvantage.
And his critique wasn't of identity politics itself. It was of the structural environment, the feedback loop of the attention economy that weaponizes that fragmentation. Individuals get caught up in policing each other's language, enforcing these rigid moral orthodoxies.
And all that energy is directed inward. Self-cancellation, internal battles.
And the outcome. The real enemy, capitalism itself, is left completely off the hook. It's just standing outside, untouched, while everyone is exhausted from the internal fight.
Okay, if we accept this level of capture, this level of fragmentation, it leads us to maybe the most difficult and provocative idea Fisher brings up.
Which he gets from Jean-Francois Lyotard's idea of libidinal Marxism.
The idea that we might, on some level, actually enjoy our own subjugation.
Lyotard's book, Libidinal Economy, is intentionally scandalous. It's designed to shock the traditional left out of its comfort zone. It just rejects the simple, sentimental idea that oppression is only ever unpleasant.
And crucially, it rejects the idea that because we're alienated, there must be some pure, non-alienated world we can get back to.
Now that sounds like a form of extreme victim blaming. How does Fisher take that idea and make it useful for politics?
That's exactly the pushback, but Lyotard's claim is more structural than moral. He made this famous, shocking claim that the English proletariat enjoyed swallowing the shit of capital.
Enjoyed the destruction of their bodies, the dissolution of their old identities, the anonymity of the suburbs.
The core paradox Lyotard is forcing on us is, what if the destruction, the artificiality, the monstrous newness of it all, what if that creates its own kind of desire, kind of morbid attraction to the intensity of it all?
He says we have to give up this fantasy of a pure outside. There's no unalienated natural state to return to. We're bound to the system not just by force, but by a very complicated, destructive attraction.
Lyotard even draws this chilling analogy between the quantitative enjoyment in Saad's writings, the sheer number of blows, and the endless quantities of capital. He insists suffering and desire are deeply linked.
So this is an update on the iPhone critique. It's not just that we like the consumer goods. It's that we have a fundamental psychological commitment to the intense, destructive dynamism of the world capital has made.
But Fisher found a strategic use for this difficult paradox. He argued that just beneath Lyotard's shocking, desire-drunk yes lies this incredible political resource,
which is the no of hatred, anger, and frustration. No satisfaction, no fun, no future. And that deep, raw discontent is what has to be contacted and converted into political action.
And we can see that kind of weaponized anger bubbling up in culture. Fisher was a huge fan of the band Sleaford Mods, for example.
Their music is a perfect example of this. It's this texture of working-class despair mixed with this just bloody-minded refusal.
Their track Job Seeker, where the singer is doing this spiteful monologue at the people in the job center, is a key example. He's not playing the part of the sad, deserving victim.
No, he's affirming this stubborn, almost aggressive autonomy. I've been sat around the house wanking, and I'm going to keep refusing your pathetic system.
It's the complete opposite of the expected proletarian image. It's affirming the desire-drunk yes to one's own bloody-mindedness, even if it's currently confined to your own living room. It's pure discontent that hasn't been polished for respectability.
And the structural problem is that right now, all of that discontent is privatized. Fisher said it's blunted by alcohol and antidepressants or directed into impotent comment box spite and empty social media outrage.
The system holds on by keeping that negativity fragmented, isolated. The whole challenge becomes, who is going to convert that latent anger, that energy, into a unified political project?
So, if the problem is the systemic capture of desire and the political stasis it creates, what's the strategy for getting out? This is where Fisher and his contemporaries started looking towards accelerationism.
A concept that really needs to be clarified because it gets misunderstood all the time.
It absolutely does. The common cynical take, which you see in some fringe ideologies, is that accelerationism means you should try to make things collapse faster. Things have to get worse before they can get better.
That is a dangerous misreading of the specific critique Fisher was interested in, which is called left accelerationism.
The real accelerationist critique is focused on our current state of frenzied stasis. The problem is that crises like the 2008 crash or huge protests, they don't produce change anymore. The old world gets destroyed, but nothing new gets built.
So the goal is a practical strategy to overcome that political impotence.
And what needs to be accelerated, following Lukács again, is the process of history itself. Capital stays in power by reifying history, by presenting it as a finished story.
Like Fukuyama's end of history after the Cold War, politics just becomes about management, not creation.
But Lukács shows that real history is always mutable. It's the uninterrupted outpouring of what is qualitatively new. We have to escape the idea that the system is finished and just move forward. History, he said, is the history of the unceasing overthrow of the objective forms that shape the life of man.
So the left accelerationist project isn't about collapsing capitalism. It's about taking the incredible technological and social tools that capitalism has already created.
And directing them toward post-capitalist goals. It requires a counter-libidinal politics that uses the capacities we already have.
This brings us to the material conditions that are already there, already challenging capitalism's basic rules. First, infogoods.
Right. Knowledge-based products. Digital files, open source software, Wikipedia. These things fundamentally break the core economic assumption of scarcity.
Infogoods work on a principle of non-rivalry. If I give you a copy of a digital file, I don't lose it. In fact, with something like open source software, the more people who have it and work on it, the better it gets for everyone.
And that is a direct contradiction to the capitalist principle of scarcity, which needs to limit access and create monopolies to make a profit.
Thinkers like Paul Mason argue that this contradiction between the possibility of free, abundant goods we can create together and a system trying to enforce artificial scarcity is the key structural weakness we have to exploit.
And second, and maybe the most critical piece for breaking that link between suffering and desire, is the post-work agenda.
Centered on mass automation and a universal basic income, UBI.
This is proposed as a revolutionary reform. Think about the current dystopian setup. Automation makes things worse because it leads to unemployment, precarity, and drives down wages for everyone else.
UBI and automation completely flip that script. Automation is embraced. It's a good thing that eliminates drudgery and gives us all more leisure. If a machine can do the work, great, let it.
And the state provides a UBI, guaranteeing everyone an income floor, whether you're employed or not.
So why is that revolutionary?
Because UBI severs the link between suffering and getting paid. If you are guaranteed an income, you suddenly have the structural power for the refusal of work. Specifically, the boring, dangerous, unfulfilling work that nobody actually wants to do.
It's a massive political lever. If millions of people can suddenly refuse to do the shit jobs, the jobs that only exist because people are terrified of destitution, the system is forced to either automate them immediately or redesign them to be genuinely fulfilling.
That's the practical acceleration of history, using capital's own productive power against its repressive logic.
So the ultimate accelerationist vision within Fisher's framework is to move beyond capitalist desire itself, beyond a culture that's just obsessed with recycling the past, and towards a world where technology frees us from drudgery, giving us the time for autonomous action, for collective organizing.
For a society that can actually decide for itself what its needs and satisfactions are, the way out is through, by accelerating the progressive potentials that are already latent in the system we have.
You know, this whole deep dive into post-capitalist desire just provides such a powerful lens for what we try to do here at Crisis and Perception.
It really does.
We're always coming back to this distinction between systems versus individual blame. And Fisher just systematically shifts the responsibility away from individual failure. You're not lazy for feeling exhausted. You're experiencing engineered time scarcity.
You're not a failure for not being able to imagine an alternative. The system has structurally blocked that imaginative capacity. He puts the blame squarely on the machineries of control.
And he makes it so clear how power operates, not through brute force, but through common sense. Capitalist realism isn't a policy you vote for. It's the air you breathe. The invisible assumption that there is no alternative, which shapes what you want and what you see, so the system just reinforces itself without anyone ever having to consciously agree with its ideology.
Which leads to the final point, that imagination itself is a structural issue. The inability to dream up something new isn't a personal artistic failing. It is a structural product of the system's success at deflecting rebellion and metabolizing desire.
Post-capitalist desire just forces you to confront this deep entanglement of desire and power. The realization that we are, on some level, libidinally committed to parts of the very system that constrains us.
And it makes it clear that real agency under capitalism can only be a collective project. By actively constructing that unified group consciousness that can articulate a positive alternative desire, a counter-libido.
So we're left with the big, unanswered questions from Fisher's unfinished work. These lectures feel like an Ariadnean thread for us to follow. Who will actually make contact with all that deep, bloody-minded anger and frustration that's being privatized right now?
And who will convert the latent joy and energy that we all possess into a cohesive political project? Fisher believed the answer wasn't going to be some individual genius or a single leader. It was a collective subject, a people that is yet to come. And the work of building that subject, of imagining that new desire, is still ours to do.
We have been discussing Postcapitalist Desire, assembled from the final lectures of Mark Fisher, edited and with an introduction by Matt Kulkerman. We encourage you to read the book or borrow it from a library. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.